And hi. Thank you all. I know that this is a really big time slot with a lot of really awesome talks. So thank you for coming to listen and learn about documentation. And welcome to Technically Speaking, How to Improve Your Code with Documentation. My name is Alexandra White. And today I'm going to introduce you to who I am and how I know what I know. I'm going to talk about what technical writing is, what documentation is, and set some expectations for the kind of work that you should be doing rather than the kind of work that the full-time technical writer does. I'll talk about purpose, why are you writing, and your audience, which is the giant buzzword that every technical writer knows. Who are you writing for? Who is your audience? We'll talk about optimizing the deliverables because there are a lot of different ways to create documentation. We'll ask the question, so what? Why did you sit here for 50 minutes and listen to this? Why does any of this matter? Why do we matter? And then I'll leave you with 6 tips for writing good docs. And I've been told there is a Slido app for questions, and the hashtag is BuildStuff2019. Or tweet me. My handle is HeyAWhite. It's on the bottom of every slide and will be at the end. Or come talk to me also, because I'm a person who's here. So first, it's loading because I added a GIF today of myself, and now I have big regrets. But what it's going to say is, my name is Alexandra White, hi. And I've been a technical writer at Google since last December. But before I was a technical writer, I was an engineer for a local television station in New York City. And I was the junior developer on a team of 5. The other developers had been there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 16 years, which meant I was supporting websites from 1999, built by the engineer who was still there. And that was really frustrating because there was no documentation. Every time I had to make a change, I had to go to that engineer and say, okay, where do I find this? How do I edit it? Are there any dependencies? That's a really unsustainable model to bring new people onto your team. It's not great. And so I thought, how can I solve this problem? The answer was I wanted to be a little creative. And you'll never see the GIF. So sad. I'll just share it on Twitter later. So once upon a time, I launched a blog for the developers at WNET. I thought about how do I tackle this task of getting people to write documentation? And I wanted to give them an opportunity to do something a little more exciting, to become a part of the WordPress community. If you're familiar with WordPress, you know that there is a large online community and people are constantly talking and sharing tips. But the real truth, the reason I started a blog was to steal as much information out of their brains as possible. It really wasn't for anyone else, it was for me. But of course, having a blog is not the only solution for documentation. I also implemented a system for creating READMEs for every new project and going back to our archive and adding as much information as possible. So you're welcome to all of the junior developers who have since joined since I left. And then I attended an infrastructure conference in July of 2016, and I was talking this poor guy's ear off about how I thought documentation was so important, how it was making me a better developer, and he said, hey, want to do that full time? And so then I became a technical writer. So now I'm in my second full-time gig at Google. I work on Google Ad Manager, which is one of the very, very many ad products that we have. And most of my work is UI focused, but I do get to act as the resident technical writer, meaning I help with the little bit of code that our users are expected to use. And despite the fact that I write docs full time now, I still believe that engineers should be really involved in the documentation process. I cannot do my job well if I am not helped by the engineers on my team. And I also get to contribute to a project called Perspective API, which I'm really passionate about. It's a machine learning program to help make the internet a little bit nicer by learning and removing or rating comments. So, you know, the comment boards, try to avoid them. Maybe, hopefully, Perspective API will make them a little bit better. But enough about me and why I write and what I write for. I'm sure that you've all faced a hurdle of starting a new job and thinking, where are the docs? How do I find this? Who built this? This is trash. Or maybe a little bit kinder, this is just a little messy. I wish that I knew how to access things. No matter who you are, no matter if you are a beginner or if you've been an engineer for 20 years, documentation helps you do your job. My goal today is to help you walk away feeling confident that you can write docs, that writing docs is going to make a difference for yourself, your future self, and your colleagues. And I also have often been told by engineers, I don't know how to write, or I don't like words, they're challenging. You do that, I'll just do code, that's what I do. But I have super great news for you. You're already a writer. Congratulations. You write emails every day, you write emails to your colleagues, maybe you write tweets. Those are fun. You have to think about it. You have to put your fingers to keyboard for expression. And all of these things are different tools for communicating. I've also yet to meet anybody who's not doing at least a little bit of writing for their job. You might be commenting on some of your code or writing design docs. There is writing you're already doing. This is just an opportunity to step it up a little bit. And I'm also really fortunate now that I work at a place that cares about technical writing and documentation, because not everywhere does, and I know that. And we also have the resources to have technical writers. Not everybody does. I think that every company who is creating a big product that is, used by, I don't know, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands more users should have a full-time technical writer. Having developers write docs is not a replacement. I am not threatened by that. In fact, I welcome it. I encourage it. Please write docs. Because my job goes beyond writing documentation. My job is to think about the coherency, the consistency, making sure that the documentation makes sense, making sure that you're not missing any steps. And working with engineers who are already writing docs means I can focus on those things and make the docs better. So, okay, what exactly is technical writing? What are we talking about? Good technical writing is not Hamlet. Good technical writing is not Shakespeare. It's clear and it's concise and it's to the point. When I was younger, I often deferred to a book series called Cliff's Notes. If you're not familiar, it takes a work or text like Shakespeare and provides a modern translation to help those of us who are not living in the times of Shakespeare understand what he was trying to say. And the translation is a lot clearer. It takes 5 kind of long, complicated lines, makes it 4 shorter, clearer lines. But translation is not the same as documentation. By integrating that translation, though, you're giving your content context. A great follow-up to this may be a README for Hamlet, a description of what the soliloquy is doing in the middle of the play, what his emotional state is. If you're not familiar with Hamlet, he has a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings, and he's just trying to work it all out. And folks, I think, who hear I'm a writer assume that I'm writing books and magazine articles and using beautiful prose and metaphors, and I am doing none of that. I will leave that to the novelists and the essayists and the digital marketers. They're great at it. Technical writing is clear, concise, conscientious commentary. It's adding value to your work. And I want to be clear in setting expectations for the kind of work that you should be doing. Your job is to fully understand the products and features you support, because that is, if you're building something, in order to build the best version of that product, you should understand what the product does, right? And by writing this information down as documentation, you can better explain it to somebody else. You're more likely to understand your own work, and you're more likely to remember it in the future. And while things like grammar are definitely important in the final product, especially if it is something that will be published externally, don't worry about that right now. It's more important to get all of the information out of your head and onto a page than to be worried about it being perfect. But again, why write? Isn't that what the tech writer does? I think writing is something like cleaning out your fridge or like exercising that people hate. People think, ugh, I don't want to do that. I don't have to do that anymore. I'm not in school. But there are people who run every single day and really enjoy it. I don't understand that, but there are people who do it. Just like there are people who write every day and enjoy it. And then there are those of us who have to force ourselves to run because we know it's good for us. And so we're doing our best, and writing is good for you too. Writing is how I learned to be a developer. So when I was in university, I took an intro to web development class, and we were asked to build our first website, to build a portfolio for all of the work that we were going to do in the professional writing program. And I thought, I don't really know how to do that. I have an understanding of HTML and CSS, but a whole website from scratch, that's going to be hard. Why don't I just take a template from online and modify it to make it look the way I want it to look, and it already looks 1,000 times better than the other projects. One could say I cheated. I'd like to say I used the resources of the internet to make a better website. And because that's what I presented, this final product of an actual website-looking website, my teacher thought, oh, you are so advanced, you should teach everybody how to write CSS. To which I thought, oh God, I've been caught. She knows the truth. I only figured out enough to modify it and change the colors. I don't know what I'm doing. So for the next 2 days, I furiously went back through the files and wrote notes to myself to define the differences between display block and display inline block, and why a parent would override a child, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing that, I actually taught myself how to write CSS so that in the future, I could write my own style sheet instead of relying on somebody else's work. Eric Mazur of Harvard University talks about something called the flipped classroom. The flipped classroom is this theory on teaching where there's 2 parts to learning. The first part is reading and absorbing information. So that could be reading a textbook, that could be watching a video, that could be listening to a lecture. And the second part is teaching. You learn by teaching what you've absorbed back to other people, taking action with the information that you've gathered. I became a better developer not just by going back through that CSS and writing notes and trying to figure out what on earth I had built, but I became a better developer because I taught the rest of the class kind of how to use CSS. I tried my best. Writing is also really important for efficiency. If you write documentation first, if you make it a priority and do it well, you don't need to go back later and write documentation when you've forgotten what you've done. And you also probably won't get 100 emails after the fact going, okay, wait, what is this? How does this work? What do I do with this information? If you do the extra work up front and write good docs, then you don't need to go back later. Writing decreases the amount of support you have to provide. If you have a support team, they're going to like you a lot more if there are already good docs. Make them like you. Running is really, really good for your health. Even if you hate doing it, forms of exercise are important. And writing is really, really good for your development as a developer. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how exactly you get the writing done, but what matters is that it is done. Documentation should not be sprinkled on top of your work. Documentation is an integral part. So sprinkles are this colorful crunch that you add at the end of a dessert. It's kind of bland. They're not particularly special. It looks nice, but it doesn't do much for you. Documentation is not the flair that you add at the end of your work. Rather, back in the States, there is a box mix called funfetti. We love box mixes. We love making things really easy. And that's when you have a vanilla cake with sprinkles that are mixed in. Kids love it. I love it. You cut in, there's rainbow sprinkles all throughout the cake. And It is possible to make funfetti without actually using a box mix. You can just mix sprinkles right into any old vanilla cake. Documentation should be like what makes funfetti really great. Integrate writing throughout your process. So, can we all agree that documentation is good and important? Does anybody disagree with that statement? It'd be really awkward if you disagreed with me, so thank you for being silent. I appreciate it. And now that we all agree, we're all on the same page, we can talk about actually how to do this. We can talk about why you would write and who you're writing for. So, finding your purpose, not in life, but in your documentation. Why are you writing? Why are you creating this material? And specifically, why are you creating any one document, and what problem does that document solve? Answering these questions is really key to being successful. Does your document exist to inform somebody of something? Do they need to know an overview of what the project is supposed to do and accomplish? Or do they need the in-depth details? Are they the person who's going to take this on after, so they want to know everything from how it was set up on the server all the way to how the front end works? Or does somebody need to know step by step how to do a process? Do they need to walk through building something or getting started? Both of those tasks are really important. Are you hoping that somebody will be able to update this without needing your help using self-service? Probably, right? You don't want people to constantly be coming to you and saying, how does something work? Do you want them to be able to use it without support? Maybe because you're helping your support team focus on other more urgent issues, or perhaps because you don't have a support team at all. This benefits both the users of the product and the creators of the product by creating those docs. And compliance. Compliance is super fun. It's a really good reason to have to write docs because you legally have to. Is there a federal regulation or a state or local regulation that you have to comply with because of what your application is? Did you make any promises to your users when you sold them the software? Did you say, hey, we're going to provide docs or we're going to provide support? Or did you sign any other contract? Definitely check on that. Make sure legally compliant docs are the least exciting and the most important. Please write them. But even more important than why is who. Who are you writing for? Know your audience. Who will be reading this document and how will they be approaching it? Are they on their desktop? Are they on their mobile device? Are they reading just because they want to learn generally about what your product does? Or do they need to do something right now, right away? Have they been stuck on a problem for the last 5 days and they're really upset and they're scared they're going to lose their job? That happens sometimes. I think actually a lot of the time, people are coming to documentation because they couldn't solve the problem on their own. And they're really frustrated and really scared. And that's not a great mood to be in when you're reading docs. You need the answer right away. But the first audience to consider when you're writing docs is yourself. It's the easiest when you're thinking about documentation because you know who you are. You know what you know most of the time. And why does this say past you? I think because you're thinking about the person who was building the product, right? So if you wrote a design document, again, for example, you were predicting the kind of work that you were going to be trying to accomplish when you produce the product. But it might not end up being what the result is. And it's possible that all of your hopes and dreams came true, but it's also possible they didn't. As at that age, 9 years old, my 9th birthday, I was definitely convinced I was going to be an actor on the stage. Didn't quite work out that way. I think I'm very happy about it, but I am kind of still on a stage, right? Presenting in front of all of you. So it did work out, just not the way that I thought it would. Your product might not be exactly what you thought it was going to be. It's important to write documentation to fill in the gaps. But even more crucial than that is thinking about your future self. So future you sometimes forgets what past you has done. How many times have you worked on a project and had to go back to it weeks, months, or years later? Just this year, Two separate groups of people came to me about a plugin I wrote in 2015. It was a bingo plugin that was created to generate randomized bingo cards for WordPress. Folks could go in, upload images, create their own. And it was for WordPress 3.8, I think, and now we're on 5.2. So there's been some time. And even though it was written in vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, it's not surprising that something went wrong. So these folks came to me and they said, hey, we found your code on GitHub, but it doesn't work. Can you help us? So I went back to the code and thought, oh, what a mess. I didn't know what I was doing. And the docs that I wrote for somebody to even use this are terrible. It wasn't clear how to actually get the images in the cards. And I had no docs for how to maintain the plugin. Had no idea how to do it. So I had to poke through every single file and try and figure it out. And I could have saved myself a lot of time had I been thinking about future me. And then there's also your colleagues. For those of us who aren't lone developers, who have a team, sometimes you may move on to a different project and the team will come and help you and take over the work. They love your docs. And often we also don't stay at a job forever. I left WNET and a new developer came and took my place. So I'm pretty sure she was happy there were some docs of some kind. And most of us, I think, who do have colleagues are very lucky. I am very lucky that I can count on these people when I travel halfway across the world to speak in front of you, that they're going to, make sure that my stuff stays up to date. And as much as this is really about writing internal documentation, because I think that's where we struggle the most, there is also the cases where you have to write content externally. People who are using your product are not the same people who built the product, right? They don't have the same level of expertise or knowledge. They're coming with something totally different. And if you're a web developer, then you might have to write documentation for a client who needs to update the website themselves. That is super important. I have gotten emails on Saturday night saying, hey, can you fix a typo for me? To which I email them back, hey, here's the documentation that I wrote for you as a part of the package of me developing your website. You can do it yourself. Save yourself a headache on a Saturday night. Write the docs in advance, send it to them, and encourage them to always use those docs. But on a larger scale of a single developer and a single client, if you're supporting a lot of users, thousands of users, you definitely don't want thousands of emails coming to you saying, hey, can you fix this typo for me? That'd be pretty terrible. Give them docs. Knowing who your audience is really crucial to how you position it. I think sometimes by being the experts, we forget steps. We just assume everybody knows. So something as simple as sign in. You might not think that's important, like, of course they know that they need to sign into the product. How are they supposed to do anything? But don't assume that anyone knows anything. Be kind to your users, but also provide them all the opportunities to do the right thing. Give them every single detail. My internal stakeholders at Google care just as much about the docs that I write for a help center as the external people, because the product's really complicated. So no one knows everything that's happening. There are 5 writers that work on my product. It's a lot of writers. I don't know everything about my product. So I rely on my colleagues to do a really good job and write really good docs. And once you have your purpose and you know who you're writing for, you can optimize the deliverables. The best time to write documentation is while you are coding. Write while you code to save yourself a headache. And the easiest way to do that is to write comments. The bits of human-friendly information that the machine doesn't care about, that is just woven throughout. So if you remember that Hamlet soliloquy from earlier, I added the modern English as comments throughout. And the comments have a really specific purpose to define what Hamlet was trying to say and give it extra context for those of us who were not born in the 1500s. But other comments could look like historical context. If Hamlet references something that doesn't make sense to us because it's not something that we face in 2019. One of the products I cover, Google Publisher Tag, has a lot of comments. I think I've been told by developers, good code should explain itself. We don't need docs. That is very frustrating to me as a technical writer. You do need docs because the code, yes, well-written code in some ways should be self-explanatory. I can look at some of the functions and understand what the function is supposed to do, but not necessarily how it's supposed to do it. So when the comments are actually comments and not in a table, which was an innovative solution for our help center, which does not really support code the way it should, you can see there's more context. So I can see that there is a function. I know that this is small, but I promise you there's a function called define slot, which means define add slot. I can guess that because I'm familiar with Google Publisher Tag. And I can also see some numbers later on in that function, which again, I can guess is the size of an ad because I'm familiar with how ads work. What I wouldn't know is that those sizes have to be in a specific order to match the UI. If that doesn't happen, the code breaks. Does that mean the code is poorly written? Who's to say? But I can say that it's really important to have that comment because otherwise people are not going to do it right. Your code should explain what it's doing, but the comments give it context. There's no way the code could tell you it has to be in order to match the UI, or it shouldn't, probably. Another example from Perspective API, if you're familiar with the tool Yarn, then you probably don't need these comments. They're not particularly helpful to you. They're very generic. But if you've never used Yarn before and you're just getting started with Perspective, then these comments are really, really important. They're helping you actually accomplish and do the thing that you want to do, installing Perspective API. So keep it stupid simple. Remember to KISS. When commenting, make sure that everything is really clear, short, but don't use acronyms that you don't explain. And while full sentences and perfect grammar are not required, it shouldn't be confusing as to what you intended. It's best, again, to do this all while you're writing the code because that's when it's the freshest. And after coding, it's important to write a README to sum up what the project is, tell developers what they need to know. It's important for future you and for your colleagues. And if the product is open source, it's really important for anybody who will work on this in the future. There's a developer named Andrei Sitnik who built this project called Size Limit, which is a performance tool for JavaScript. It's really awesome, but even more awesome than the tool itself is the README. I love this documentation. It's so beautiful. There's so much in it. It clearly spells out what the project is supposed to do. You can't see it, but that is actually a GIF that shows the product in action. It gives some credit to different people who are actually using it. So I feel like, oh yeah, if these websites are using it, I can use it too. But what makes a good README? A good README should have a project title. That feels kind of obvious, right? You should name whatever your project is. It should have a project description, 1 to 2 sentences that say, hey, this is what this project does. This is how you can accomplish your goals. What are the prerequisites? Does somebody need to have a library of some form installed? Or is there a configuration file they need to set up? Do they need to set up environment variables? How do they do that? How do you install the project? How do you use it? That might be really complicated. In particular, how to use it, especially if it's a really big product. So you can just say, here's a link to all of our documentation. You can list all of the people who contributed to it if it's open source and your rules of how to contribute. Or again, that could be really long. You could have a lot of rules, so that can be a separate file too. Contact information. How do they get a hold of you if something doesn't work? Maybe you don't want to include that. Maybe things don't work. I get that. And also really important, what is your license? Include a license. If you attended Jeff's talk yesterday, then you know licensing is really important. Bonus points if you include a table of contents, if your README is really long, or any images or GIFs that show the product in action, links to further reading like more documentation or your company's website, and frequently asked questions. There's also a README CLI generator by Frank Abgral. think that I'm pronouncing that right. And it looks at existing Git configurations to build that README. So you don't always have to do everything from scratch. There are a lot of generators that will make work for you. It's also really important to write those step-by-step instructions. These can be internal facing, helping your developers and helping your team build the product, or external facing, helping folks use the product. And from basic steps to advanced step-by-step tutorials, this is maybe, to me, the most important work that you do. It can be written step-by-step tutorials. It could be a collection of GIFs or a screencast. But I will say, if you use visual documentation, it doesn't replace the written documentation. Make sure that there's always written steps to go along with any video. And a super secret tool that tech writers use is templates. So writing from scratch every time is really, really challenging, and you should not have to do that. Creating templates means that it's going to be really consistent. You're going to have the same format. Users will know what to expect every time. You're going to set their expectations for what they can learn from your document. And if you have technical writers available, they can create custom templates for you so that it's easier for you to just write something and get it done. I also have some sample templates for you too, if you don't have technical writers. Release notes. This is a super fun piece of writing that you're probably already doing if you're a software engineer. After you finish coding, release notes are really important to tell users, okay, what happened, what's changed. The most important function is to do just that, to inform users of what changed. It might be a new feature in the product, it might be the deprecation of a feature, or the deprecation of the entire product. That happens sometimes. Here is an example of a release note from my favorite app, Dalio. Do or do not, there is no try. I am afraid, my friend, that today you need to choose your side. You can choose the light path of righteous or sinister dark. The choice is yours if you have updated to the latest iOS 13. What is that? It took me a moment. I read it a few times. Like, oh, okay, it's because there's light and dark mode now in iOS. They were trying to be cute. That's really frustrating. I don't like that I had to read it so many times to understand. Humor and fun can totally be had here. Have a good time writing release notes, but don't sacrifice clarity just to be fun. Another really terrible example, one that you've seen a million times. Bug fixes performance improvement. What is that? What does that mean? What bugs? Should I use my data? Should I update right away? Is everything going to crash if I don't? Is there a 0-day problem that is out there in the world that I need to address? How many times have you seen this? Probably every single day. Every time you update apps on your phone, you've seen this. I don't think it could be more vague. So please give me a little more detail. Tell me more about what's happening so I know how important it is that I update. Caveat, of course, to that is sometimes the legal team says, no, you cannot tell them more details. This is better than no note at all. But when you can, please tell me more information. The best release notes are informative. They tell you what's happening and what they need to know. Remember that your readers are human. You're human. Well, your readers are probably human. I can't guarantee that. And remember to balance creativity with the facts. Sometimes people do really want funny release notes. I get that, but don't be so funny and clever that people don't know what happened. There are a lot of really good talks about release notes. My fellow technical writer, Ann Edwards, wrote a really great one called Learning to Love Release Notes, and I'm going to share some of her template examples. So, for example, you can now target specific time ranges with date time range targeting. A you can now note tells a user about a new thing they can do, like targeting date time ranges. An X no longer does Y, or X now does Y. Tell a user about a feature or product that now exists or no longer exists. And X no longer does Y. This means you no longer need to do Z. Congratulations, user. You no longer need to use a workaround to do a thing you should have been able to do the entire time. So for more on this, I highly recommend watching Anne's talk. And blog posts. The cheeky thing that I did with my colleagues to learn more about the type of work they were doing. So it's really going above and beyond. You don't have to write blog posts if you don't want to. I know it's challenging. It's not for everybody. But it's also marketing your skills to possible future employers. So there is extra benefit to doing this for those of you who are up for the challenge. My former colleague, Will, was our most persistent writer. I'm very grateful for him. We integrated OAuth into all of our websites, and there really weren't many posts out there that were explaining how to use OAuth in WordPress. Or there were a few, but they were poorly written, and we didn't understand them. I didn't anyway. So his two-part piece kind of became the de facto standard, and a lot of people came to us and said, oh, thank you for that. I couldn't figure it out. So really grateful for him. What makes a good blog post? Who, what, why, how? These questions that we always have to answer in life. Who are you and how do you know what you know? You don't always have to say that at the top of the blog post. That's what bios are for. Why should people listen to you? What's your expertise? What is this blog post about? Again, it might feel like it's obvious, but you definitely need to say what you're going to talk about and why you're going to talk about it. Why does it matter? Why is a user going to spend their time reading this blog post instead of watching a fun YouTube video? And how are they going to understand this topic? How are you going to get all that information across? You're not necessarily writing that answer in your blog post, but it's something you need to understand while you're creating it. And once you've written it, there are a number of places you can publish it. If you have a technical blog on your company's website, that's awesome. That's a really good answer. If you have a personal blog, again, great answer. Then there are lots of great technical posts on Medium. I'm sure some of you have seen them, and lots more places. If you're hip to a cool place to publish tech blog posts, please tell me, because I'd like to be cooler. Thank you. And there are a number of awesome examples out in the world. Etsy's Code is Craft is an amazing technical blog. Pinterest Engineering, CSS Tricks, which started in the late 2000s, was 100% how I learned how to be a front-end developer after I cheated. I mean, used resources from the internet expertly. And of course, the Google Developers blog, I have to mention us too. Okay, but so what? Y'all just sat here, you listened, I'm grateful for you. Why does any of this matter? Why did I talk at you about this? Reading is a really fundamental tool to learn. We've all been taught from our earliest ages to now that reading is the way to get yourself new information. Reading books, reading documentation. But reading is passive learning. Writing and teaching is active learning. When I was in school preparing for major exams, the best way I could find to do it was to write outlines of my textbooks. So instead of just reading it and hoping that I would remember, I would write it back in my own words. And that really helped me understand what was happening. And I definitely did better for the exams that I spent the time writing the outlines for. And again, for writing documentation and learning new tools, it really made a big difference for me personally. So in my first job as a technical writer, I was asked to explain, how does Docker work? I didn't even know what Docker was. Like, okay, show somebody an example of how to containerize an application. So I went and I read Docker's docs and I thought, I still don't get it. I don't know how to do this. So I instead decided to go through the process of trying to build a Docker application. And every time I failed, and I failed a lot, I wrote down why I failed, what happened, and that way, when I wrote the documentation, I could explain where the possible pitfalls were so that other people didn't make the same mistakes. Knowledge is power. If you're a developer who says, this doesn't need documentation, the code explains itself, you're talking from a position of privilege, because not everybody has time to go back and read through all the code and try and figure it out. There are lots of folks who are doing 100 other things and make it a little bit easier for them to do the work. It's 2019. There's no reason to not be inclusive of everybody. 100% of developers who are better developers write docs. This is a not tested statistic. I made it up, but I believe it is true. You will be better if you write docs. So I hope that you agree with me. I really hope I've sold you at this point that it's important. So here are some final tips to help you be a successful writer. Be concise. You know who wasn't concise? Shakespeare. Could that man write any more? I don't think so. Don't use 5 words when one will do. Make sure you use the right word. So don't say implementing when you mean install. If the zombie apocalypse were to happen, you wouldn't say, oh my God, people have risen from the dead, they're coming back, they're eating brains, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Not helpful. You would say, zombies, run, take cover. Get moving, people. Start your writing process with a brain dump. Get all of the information out of your head and on to the page. That will be the most helpful to start organizing your thoughts. Once all the content is out there, you can put headers in, you can make step-by-steps, you can add bullets. And it is important to have organized documentation. If you believe it's important to have an organized database, then you should believe it's important to have organized docs. And your document should address the problem and then solve that problem. So another example of me and box mixes. Really loved them. Loved them so much as a kid. There was a brownie mix. I really wanted brownies. I think I was 11 years old. And there are only 2 ingredients you need to add to make the brownies: eggs and oil. I didn't pay attention. I just added the oil and no eggs. And the brownies came out of the oven an hour later. So sad. Not brownies. Chocolate bricks that were inedible. I tried really hard. I couldn't do it. And you know what? That's not the box mix's fault. That's my fault. I wasn't paying attention. I just thought, oh, I know how to do this. This is easy. You can't trust that your readers are going to follow every single step, but if the step doesn't exist at all, then they can't be successful. When you're documenting your code, remember your audience. Remember who you're writing for. And again, the easiest answer is you. You know you better than anybody, probably. But the person might not look like you. They might not have your same level of expertise. There's something that we call the curse of knowledge. So that's when you know so much that it's really hard for you to go back and remember what it was like not to know anything at all. I had a distinct advantage at that first technical writing job when I was asked to write an intro to using Docker, because I didn't know what Docker was. I didn't know what I didn't know. And by going through that process, I was uniquely situated to help other people who didn't know anything. Just because a person is really smart and well-informed about something doesn't mean they know what you know. So try and help them out. Ask for feedback. You wouldn't publish any code without doing a code review, hopefully, maybe. So don't publish docs without asking for somebody to read through them, and do a little bit of bug checking, text checking. That can be for something like a spelling error, that's important, but also have somebody walk through the steps you wrote. See if you were missing something. And finally, write as you code. If there's one takeaway that you take from today, if you do it while you're coding, you're not going to have to do it later. You'll know more. It'll be better. You know most about the project when you're actually building it. Remember to mix your doc sprinkles into your work. Docs should be like funfetti. Celebrate when you cut into your code and see all of the documentation, and everybody else will celebrate with you. Thank you very much. And here are some credits for all of the images I used. Legal. Uh-huh. I think that's a big problem, and a lot of people are writing comments that say exactly what the code does. And good code, in some ways, should explain itself, right? Like if the code says get customer by ID, writing the comment get customer by ID is not helpful. What does somebody do with that ID? Where does it go later? What should the ID look like? Is the ID a string of numbers? Is it letters and numbers? Is it a name? Giving more information that can't actually be found in the code is what's useful. That said, there are exceptions to every rule, right? Sometimes you might think it's self-explanatory. That is a very good example of one that I think we all agree is self-explanatory, but sometimes it might not be immediately clear to somebody who doesn't know the language that you're writing in, who isn't familiar. So just being aware of that caveat. Does that answer your question? I think you need to go and find out where the ID comes from, because that will be really hard for somebody who didn't write the code to go and look at it and think, if the person who was writing the code didn't know where it came from, that's a problem. The person who's using it won't know what to do with it either, and where to find that information. Yes, remembering it as a priority. So I think that often people finish the project and then move on with their life and move on to the next thing, which I totally get. I often want to put things in a box and never go back to it again. But especially if the product is something that's out in the world and that is changing, it's important to remember to write your docs while the code is changing. Like that's the same, it's writing docs later in the process, but anytime there is a change, you should write the instructions at the same time. Making it a part of the engineering culture is really the key. I can talk all day about how docs are amazing and how everyone should write them. And you can be an engineer who believes that too. I think by being in this room, you must think docs are important to some degree. But not everyone thinks that. And if your leadership doesn't think that, the engineering managers don't think that, it's really hard to maintain up-to-date docs. It's got to be a culture of documentation. And I have more thoughts on that for when I am not on a mic. Yes. Sure. So the question was really, isn't isn't bad documentation technical debt? And especially if things change, you have to go back and maintain that, it can be a problem. How often should you actually be documenting? Should you document everything? You shouldn't document absolutely everything. I lean towards more is better than less, but I totally see your point. If if something if the documentation is wrong and out there, people get upset. Like, I followed your instructions and I still couldn't do the thing. That's really frustrating, and I get that. I generally take the position that it's better to have something than nothing, because if there's nothing, people are floundering around wondering, what do I do? And no idea have how to get started. When you can when there is a place that it feels obvious, like get customer by ID, definitely don't include a comment. It's not necessary there. But don't assume that everybody knows things like environment variables, setup materials. Those are probably the most important and the most important to keep up to date. I tend to lean towards get the beginner stuff done and worry about the advanced stuff later, because the advanced stuff is often what changes the most. That said, if some big customer is paying you a lot of money to have instructions and support, then it can be time consuming, it can be technical debt, but it's really important to just make it a priority and to make it a part of the coding process. I would hopefully remember everything I just talked about, because we have different priorities, right? As a technical writer, my goal is to tell everybody, you need docs, write more docs, write good docs. And as a developer, write good code, have a better product, make sure that nothing breaks, make sure that you can do the next project. But institutionalizing that docs culture made a really big difference in my last job. And I would make sure that I only go somewhere that either has it or wants it to be a priority, or making myself the personal brand documentation person, the person that advocates for it as a part of the review process, for example, because we should be held accountable for our docs just as much as we're held accountable for our code. I think the time is up, but that said, please come ask questions up to me. So thank you.